Welcome back to the Investigator discussion series. I'm rather Incoherent, this is Minh Thi fan. Now, Minh is a character that I've seen a lot, but it's also a character where I find myself struggling to say I feel confident in the best way to build her. And I think maybe part of that is because her card pool is the best card pool in the game. So I suppose let's start there. Deck size 30, Seeker 0 to 5, Neutral 0 to 5, Survivor 0 to 2. Seeker Survivor is an insanely powerful combination of cards. It is such a powerful card pool that trying to get a deck down to 30 cards is incredibly difficult. And as we get into Minh's signatures, we're going to start exerting a little bit of pressure on how you want to build Minh that makes it even more difficult to feel like you're doing the best you can with Minh. Essentially, the reason I don't have a ton of confidence in Minh, despite having seen a lot of her, is because it feels like there are so many different ways to build Minh that are all so different from one another. So I'm going to give a nod to some of the different alternative strategies that I'm not going to be showing today, and I'm going to talk about what I think the best thing you can do with her is. But before we get any further, let's talk about what she actually does on the front. Her stat line is 4 head and 2 foot in terms of Mythos defensive stats. That's perfectly fine, 6 average, 4 in one of them is pretty much good for Mythos defense. You're not happy with 2 foot, that requires some work to be safe, and frankly, Minh's not great at making yourself safe to that 2 foot. There are ways to deal with it, and in particular, if you're going for Dream Diary to solve your weakness, it tends to not be a problem. But it is worth noting that 2 foot's a weakness, and it's so hard to fit cards into a Minh deck that it's an unusually hard weakness to deal with, even though Seeker normally wouldn't be that bothered by a 2 foot. Minh has 4 in Book and 2 in Fist. As is so often the case with 4 book Seekers, we've wasted a point in Fist. 4 is still completely and totally functional in a Seeker. You'll have no trouble getting that to 6, beating every Shroud location on the map, and finding tons of ways to accelerate your clues, so despite not being 5 book, you're perfectly happy with it. Little bit of a suboptimal stat line, but not bad by any stretch of the imagination, just bad by Seeker standards. She also has a 7/7 split of Soak, as always, post in the thick of it, that comes out to be 6/6, perfectly fine, it's what you expect. Her ability is Reaction. After an investigator at your location commits a card to a skill test, that card gains a question mark icon until the end of the test, limit once for each investigator per round. So essentially, everyone at your location at some point during the turn is going to get a question mark icon to something they commit. I'm not going to say that's insanely powerful, but it is a powerful effect, especially if you're playing with more skill-oriented teammates who are actually going to capitalize on this pretty regularly. It's essentially +1 to a test every round. If it's a Mythos test, it's at its best, but if it's still just like going into your own test and making you beat the -4 instead of the -3, that's still value. It's not an incredible ability, but it definitely is good. And her star effect is +1. You may choose a skill card committed to this skill test to return to its owner's hand after this test ends, which is fine. It's not as good as it sounds like it would be, because unless you're playing the most skill-heavy Minh decks possible, most Minh decks I've seen, I went through a couple in Arkham DB to make sure I wasn't missing anything obvious. I always do this before characters I'm not confident on. But most Minh decks I see run somewhere between like 8 and 14 skills, usually on the lower end of that. The skill density I'm about to show off is, I think, 10 skills. And a lot of the time, you're just going to be taking a test where you're doing the Seeker thing and digging in the bag to get through a 2-shroud location at a perfectly fine speed. So despite the fact that you will commit a lot of skill cards on Minh, it's not enough that like every test this can trigger, and the best stars are ones that are going to trigger every time you get a star. This simply doesn't, and it makes it a somewhat middling at best star. Coming over to her signature, Minh's one of those characters where her signature really warps the way you want to play her. It is a 3-cost slotless asset, commits for 2 question marks, and its text is that you may commit 1 card to each skill test performed by an investigator at another location. So now you can commit cards across the map, that's no longer a restriction for you. And reaction, after you commit exactly 1 card to a skill test, exhaust Analytical Mind, draw a card. So that is a really powerful effect. A lot of people, past me amongst them, have said that Analytical Mind would have been a completely character warping card if you could start with it and play on Minh, but because you're going to need to find this and then play it, and it costs you tempo and resources and it's not cheap, it's just not. Like, there's this dream when you play Minh where you're gonna be throwing skills across the map, and then when you sit down to build the deck and try to fit the rest of your role into it, it just feels a little bit underwhelming. Analytical Mind is good, make no mistake. Draw 1 card a turn, this bottom part is actually the most important part of the test. This is in a lot of ways very similar to Harvey's signature, where the thing about it that seems really cool, the fact you can commit cards across the map, usually just doesn't matter as much as you might expect it to. Generally speaking, when I find myself playing alongside of a flex that wanders off to do their own thing, they usually are safe to the Mythos phase. That's part of why they were comfortable leaving. So you can absolutely set up teams in a way where Analytical Mind will matter a ton, but I frankly have often just viewed this as a pretty good draw card. And there are lots of other pretty good draw cards. It's not a bad signature by any means, but it feels like it has a lot of promise that I've never seen it live up to. Meanwhile, the King in Yellow is actually a pretty harsh signature weakness. I've always said it can be dealt with relatively easily, but that's more as a counterpoint to the people who are terrified of this weakness. It's bad, make no mistake, but it's not backbreaking. It is a hand asset. In Revelation, it enters your threat area, it cannot leave except through the reaction below, so you can't just replace it with something. And that's really important, because it means if you haven't drawn the King in Yellow, your second hand slot is actually not safe. You might have to discard it. And if you're rapidly cycling your deck, like Seekers often want to do, you probably just don't have a second hand slot, because it's constantly getting dropped by the book. What's the book actually doing though? You cannot commit exactly 1 or 2 cards to a skill test. You can only commit 3+ cards to a skill test, meaning you can only commit cards to your own skill test as well. And then reaction after a skill test is successful, in which Minh Thi fan has committed at least 6 matching skill icons for that test, discard the King in Yellow. So to get rid of this, you need to commit 3 cards for 6 icons. The 6 icons part's really not that hard. Generally speaking, if you have 3 cards, you probably have 6 icons. There are some situations you find yourselves in where you're like committing 2 skills for 2 icons each and just like throwing a random event at it for 1 book. And in that case, you might have to commit a 4th card. But generally speaking, this is a hassle to deal with. It forces you to alter your play pattern for a while. You have to commit 3 cards to pass it, and getting auto-failed on this just always completely sucks. I'm gonna need to talk about Dream Diary here briefly, because Dream Diary is a card so many people, myself amongst them, have run specifically because it's so good in men. If you have Analytical Mind in play, having Dream Diary to give you Unexpected Courage turn after turn after turn, so you're able to give anyone on the map an Unexpected Courage in the Mythos phase and then draw a card every round is just inherently valuable on a men. It's even better than Unexpected Courage if you have the conditions met for this. It's going to be a Promise of Power. And then because you're getting that Unexpected Courage in your hand every turn, it makes it so much easier to deal with the King in Yellow. Now you only need 2 skill cards from your hand, and it's so much easier to get to a total of 4 icons amongst those other cards than it is to get to 6 without the Dream Diary. So Dream Diary is really good in men for helping to deal with this and helping to capitalize on her signature asset. But Dream Diary is also a card, like all research cards, that makes you weaker in Scenario 1. I'm not like preaching that research cards are bad at all, but it's additionally a card that's going to cost you experience and send you down a path where you need to upgrade the Dream Diary pretty immediately. And research librarians aren't free. They take up an ally slot and resources and time, and in a class with Milan, it might not be a part of Dream Diary, but running Dream Diary tends to mean you're running Charisma as well. So coming over to a support men deck that I threw together for the purposes of demonstration, if you're running Dream Diary, you're very frequently going to be running a Charisma as well to get your Milan or whatever non-research librarian ally you want into play. On top of that, I tend to find that in support men, I can't really justify not running Archive of Conduits, because if my team is expecting me to give them Unexpected Courage in the Mythos phase every round, sometimes you just miss the research librarians and don't draw this for a long time. Sometimes there's a flex off on his own and I never find Analytical Mind, or at least in the first half of the scenario, I don't. So having the Archive of Conduits to heal in case I fumble my opening hand and can't help them on the Mythos phase early is always nice. Additionally, it just fits in with what the goal of the deck is. I don't need to focus, if I'm playing a more support-oriented deck, as hard on getting clues. But Archive of Conduits, Dream Diary, and Charisma as a package run you 10 experience. It's not cheap. So you're spending like the first scenario and a half just getting a bunch of support cards that really don't make you faster at your role. And something that I never really talk about, but it is true and part of how I evaluate support characters, is that when you talk about the strength of a support character, it begs the question. It makes the assumption that your team actually needs you to support them in the way that you offer. Now, Min is offering that you can pass any test, and offering that she can heal you if you failed. These are fairly generic, valuable ways to support your team. However, it's still making that assumption, and there are a lot of characters where if I'm able to give them an Unexpected Courage every turn of the game, they're like, oh, that's cool. You might want to use it on yourself instead, I'm fine. And Min only has 2 in foot, so she very well may be better off using it on herself. So while it's 10 experience of a very, very good support, and there are teams that care about this, it's not 10 experience of support cards that are definitely 100% helping my team, and I haven't improved myself in 2 scenarios at all for actually doing my job on a team. I'm not going to cover this deck in too much more detail. There are other ways you can run support cards, and I would love to hear people in the comments explain to me why I'm undervaluing support men. But in my experience, support men feels like I'm building a deck around Analytical Mind and 1 additional question mark, and the value just isn't there for me, at least not compared to a Tempo Men deck, which is what we'll be showing off today, where we cut the Dream Diary, we cut the Charisma, we cut the Archive of Conduits, and this is a 26 experience deck core, which is only, 1 experience cheaper, but I've already got both copies of Cryptic Research and the deck core. Because the massive thing going for Tempo Men compared to many other Seekers, at least the way I'm building her, is that she's just stupidly fast. You get this deck finished by like scenario 3. Without the Cryptic Researches, this is an 18 experience deck core. That's it, that's the whole deck. That's upgraded deductions and perceptions. At 26 experience, I'm seriously considering Studious. Very often in deck cores, I will be showing decks that have clear things they want to build into. Yesterday when I was showing off Mark Harrigan, Garish Kadakia would be incredible in a flex mark, but it wasn't in the deck core because like you're just not there yet. It's not important to the deck. It's not part of your main focus. With Tempo Men, your main focus is drawing enough cards so that every turn you're committing deduction or you're committing sharp vision, and if you're not committing those, at least you're using a Mariner's Compass for the extra clue anyway. The goal of a Tempo Men is very simple. Do not take a skill test unless it gets you 2 clues. And this is still a valuable support deck. It's not like you don't have any power. You still have Men's ability. You're still helping your teammates if they help themselves and they're with you. But very importantly, if you run 2 copies out of Crossroads, 2 copies of Cryptic Research, and 2 copies of Deep Knowledge, you usually won't need that much draw yourself. Having 6 copies of Draw 3 in your deck that you can give to your team very directly ends up being team support in like pretty much every team. And I tend to value Draw 3 higher than Unexpected Courage. I value it higher than Healing, because it can do those things as well. Just +3 cards is a massive amount of value. So even though this deck isn't built into support as much as the other decks, it's still very, very good at supporting. In terms of dealing with the King in Yellow, I mean, the plan's pretty straightforward. We have all the draw in the world. We run 10 skills. It's not pretty breaking the King in Yellow in this deck. Something you often find yourself wanting to do is specifically holding Sharp Vision if you haven't drawn the King in Yellow yet. That way you're gonna have an easier time getting through it when you draw it. Because if you have a 3 icon, doesn't matter what icon, skill, it makes it really easy to get through King in Yellow with any other 2 cards. If you don't, then you can find yourself in a rough spot. The same thing applies to Perception level 2 as well. It's just a more expensive card you might not have quite as early. So the main strength of Tempo Men is that she's just incredibly fast, not just on experience. Magnifying Glass is fine. Mariner's Compass takes a play action, but it generates perpetual clue acceleration. Milan takes a play action. He generates perpetual resources, which you can either use to, fund the Mariner's Compass for more reliability or play other things you haven't gotten into play yet. This Milan might seem questionable with Mariner's Compass. There are other allies you can run. I really value the book boost, and I don't like Jeremiah Kirby in a 10 skill deck. One of Empirical Hypothesis for draw, one of Pathfinder for recursive movement. Every single one of these assets either instantly does something to make itself worth being on my board, or it's fast. It's disgusting. As for the King in Yellow, I can intelligently pick up my Magnifying Glass and put it back in my hand. If I have the second one in hand, I can just not care about losing the first one to King in Yellow. It's just not really a problem with the way this is built. And then, yeah, the rest of the deck is draw, economy, draw my skills, and duplicate them, and move. The deck's stupidly cheap, stupidly fast, both on experience and in terms of the way it plays. When you're actually getting clues as men, you're investigating with Sharp Vision. You're using Practice Makes Perfect to duplicate deduction, ideally, but you might be hitting draw, or autofail negation. You're still getting the clues with deduction, eventually guaranteed, and you're trying to use Mariner's Compass as well as often as you can. Tempo Men looks very, very similar to a Tempo Daryl, and she definitely plays notably weaker than a Tempo Daryl. She does get Cryptic Research, but the most important stuff in this deck is not Cryptic Research, it's all the stuff that comes before it. It's the first 18 experience of the deck. And before I move on to the starter deck, I do want to mention the side deck down here. There's a lot of really powerful stuff men can do that is worth mentioning, and it will steamroll campaigns. However, I don't think it's the strongest thing men can do, and almost the entire counter argument just comes down to the following statement: experience and opportunity cost exist. So let's get into them. Astounding Revelation doesn't really have a place in this deck. In the previous support deck, if you're running Research Librarians to find your Dream Diaries, you can always consider a one-of Astounding Revelation. I think it's very cute. I personally don't like playing like that because I've had the Mulligan experience playing a deck like that where I just drew it half the time and it was the worst card in my deck. Mathematically, it should be brilliant if you're playing a Dream Diary support sort of met. Next up on the list is Scavenging. Scavenging is very good in Min. She has more book than most survivors and more access to ways to boost her book. She's better at triggering this than most characters, and in terms of what she can get for triggering it, well, she has access to the Necronomicon, which she can get into play by repeatedly dropping it with a magnifying glass. She has access to ice picks, which are essentially deduction with a hand slot, and she has access to Eon charts, where instead of refilling them, you can just play the second one and then pick up the first one with Scavenging at some point during the second one. There's a lot of cool stuff you can do with Scavenging. And one copy of Scavenging and one Necronomicon playing the greedy version is 10 experience. Before Cryptic Research, the whole deck was 18 experience. It's not that I don't think Scavenging Necronomicon is sick, it's that I would get that like halfway through a campaign. It's not the core part of the deck, it's really cool and really powerful, but it's just not something I would spend early experience on. I would be picking up improved deductions, I would be picking up sharp visions, I'd be picking up so many things, but Scavenging combos wouldn't be one of them. Later on, once I've got Cryptic Research, sure, when we're going into 40, 50 experience in the late game of modern campaigns, we can start getting crazy Scavenging combos, but it's not something I value as like the immediate thing the deck does, because when I'm considering my experience, my options are Pathfinder, At a Crossroads, Cryptic Research, Sharp Vision, or 6+ experience for Scavenging combos. It's like, Jesus, everything else costs so little experience and it's so high tempo. It's not that Scavenging is bad. It's just that it costs a lot of experience, a lot of opportunity cost, and it doesn't come, like that opportunity cost does not come cheap. It is so much opportunity cost. You could look at this and say like, I don't want to go for Cryptic Research immediately. I'll leave deduction on the table for a little while. That shaves 12 experience down to 14, and I'm gonna go for Scavenging earlier. I personally don't agree with that, but if you wanted to go for Scavenging, I would say like, do that. Go for the first 14 experience I just talked about, upgrade deduction later because you're going for a clue combo already, upgrade Cryptic Research later just because it's expensive, and pick up Scavenging around scenario 3 or 4. Especially now with the taboo list where this costs 2 experience. I personally never liked the Scavenging decks in Min. I've always thought they were overhyped because recursion's fundamentally powerful and sort of game breaking, but I feel like the actual effect of it wasn't that crazy. Now, especially with the experience taboo, I just can't justify going for it early at all. Studious is here because it's studious. There's nothing else to talk about, but Eye of Truth here is here for a very different reason. This is the reason I actually don't really like playing pure support Min very much. Because while I'm talking about how easily you could strip this down to 14 experience and then go into Scavenging, I don't feel like I can easily strip down support Min at all. I feel like support Min's entire frame, barring maybe deduction 2, and that's a card I really want, is pretty core. So coming over to the pure tempo version of Min, if I can cut down to 14 experience pretty easily, I can get Eye of Truth pretty easily. If from here I just bought 2 copies of Eye of Truth, that puts this at 36 experience with 2 Eyes of Truth and a pure speed deck where I'm going to draw it incredibly quickly. That's a lot of team support. Maybe not as much, but also maybe more than what Dream Diary is offering. So I don't really value pushing that experience into Dream Diary, because as the campaign winds on, it will end up coming at the cost of other support cards. Because let's be real, Cryptic Research and Eye of Truth are support cards, and they're better support cards than Dream Diary. Coming down to the starter deck, I'm taking an In the Thick of It for At a Crossroads and Unrelenting. The draw is just very valuable. I'm running a 1-of Resourceful in the starter deck. I don't like Resourceful very much in Min when all I'm recurring is At a Crossroads and Unrelenting for draw, because that means that if it's in your opening hand, it's a dead card. It can be very awkward. I like upgrading this into things that just draw without extra steps, but it's worth noting that in Min, you can just use Resourceful on a skill test and then immediately trigger an At a Crossroads on somebody with it. It's actually a really good card in her, and if you wanted to play a more support-oriented build, where you're more intentionally triggering your draw cards on other people, Resourceful probably has a spot in your late-game deck. But here, it's really just being used as pseudo-draw because it can pull Unrelenting or At a Crossroads. Unexpected Courage is just more valuable when you have less draw. With more draw, you can find the skills you actually want to use and be safe to the King in Yellow with that. Without all of that draw to have massive hand size all the time, Unexpected Courage is just here to make sure I can break the King in Yellow. Same thing with Inquiring Mind, because generally speaking, if I'm breaking the King in Yellow, it's almost always on an Investigate test for clues, meaning this will be active. A lot of the stuff in the late game deck where we're talking about Pathfinder and Cryptic Researches really don't have level 0 analogs, so as a result, we're up 1 Mouse Mask in terms of permanent assets as well. Mouse Mask is a card where I would love to have 2 of it. I just can't find a cut I'm happy with. I think the second resource was better. You still have a ton of draw. I'm happy just having this Mouse Mask here as long as I can get away with it. I'm kind of sad it can't make it into my final deck. Speaking of sad, I'm very aware that Grim Memoir is just very good in every Seeker, 4-book Seekers especially, because they like the 2-book more. I'm building a draw heavy deck to try to make sure I have everything I need. I like Grim Memoir a lot, but I really can't fit it into this deck. Now, normally I discuss upgrade paths, but in this case, I don't know there is one. The whole deck's 26 experience. Cryptic Research is the last out of everything I put in the deck, which brings us down to 18. Of the 18, I guess Deduction's the least valuable because you want the draw first, so that brings you down to 14. And at 14 experience, there's not an upgrade path, just get the rest of the cards in the deck. I mean, 12, because you don't really need to upgrade Magnifying Glass, right? So Pathfinder, the second Unrelenting, the Sharp Visions, Upgraded Perceptions, those are my highest priorities, but like honestly, the whole deck is just spending, like outside of the second Unrelenting and the Sharp Visions and the Pathfinder, so that's 5 experience. Outside of that, everything in the deck is just a minor incremental upgrade that adds a ton of value to the deck, and nothing super important. In terms of the cuts, I would say Sharp Vision is essentially the upgrade to Inquiring Mind, essentially be doing the same thing for Breaking the King in Yellow, but offering you an additional clue as well. Worse at Mythos Resistance, but this sort of Mendex plan is very much just, will probably win before the game can kill me. You've got Milan for Soak, and outside of that, you've got a lot of speed, and that's pretty much the plan. You can argue I should build with more Mythos Resilience. I might just be delusionally confident. I've seen like multiple iterations of Tempo Men just beat the game before they could die without really giving a shit about Mythos Resilience, so I'm just not worried about it, which could be delusional confidence on my part. Which brings us to the tier list, and I currently have Men, despite how highly I'm speaking of her, towards the bottom of A tier. When I say very strong, I mean it. The people in A tier are all absolutely cracked. I think of like everyone at the top of my B tier as being incredibly strong. Akachi, Parallel Skids, Nacho, even Finn and Daniela. I think they're incredible characters. The people in A tier are genuinely busted and very rarely struggle in campaigns. I think you can build a support men that will make your team feel very, very safe, and I think you can build tempo men's that are disgustingly fast. I just don't think that they're meaningfully better than most of the characters in A tier. I mean, she's 4 ranks under Parallel Pete right now, and Parallel Pete basically says, haha, I played the guitar and enemies don't exist anymore. Dexter Drake is one of the best users of Cyclopean Hammer, one of the most broken cards in the game. Zoe Samaras is the best Blessed Fighter you have. Diana Stanley is just an incredibly reliable Mystic with a disgusting amount of cancels. Maybe she's better than Diana. I might be willing to give that to her. Diana's cancels are often wasted. She's reliable and strong, but she does have like the slight slowness at the start. And sure, that's not inherently a problem, but compared to the hilarious Men Go Burr deck I just showed, like Min is so fast when you build her for tempo that the Mythos plan is basically, I don't have time to die, we'll be out of here before that's a problem. And if you're playing a genuinely scary campaign, you can absolutely solve that by playing more support-oriented versions of Men. And I think that's sort of what it comes down to, why I think so highly of Men, is that depending on what campaign and what team you're in, you can balance between the tempo and support decks. If your team's very scared of the Mythos, if you have like a pretty greedy Finn Edwards as a teammate, for instance, or a Finn that's not going for big money and will never have well connected, then Min gets a lot better as a support character, and she gives up some of that tempo to make sure her teammates stay safe. And it's sort of what I was talking about with Flexmark, where Flexmark isn't better than Fighter Mark, but it's exactly as good in the right team. I don't think support men is generally better than tempo men, but I think in a team that needs the support, it will perform better than tempo men and overall at a pretty similar level, and it just gives her a wider range of teams that she fits into very smoothly. I think she's very fast, I think she's very strong, I think her capacity to build support if her team needs it matters a lot, and I just don't think she's better than most people in A. Parallel Zoe is a disgustingly effective fighter, enabling the archetype for other characters. Dexter Drake, dear God, that Cyclopean Hammer is not okay is the summary, but it's just generally a very strong deck. The people above Men are so good. Even the people below Men, like, my table sometimes goes back and forth on whether or not Men or Ursula is better. She's not that much better than Ursula, but Ursula has to get this core experience. The core experience for Men is like 5 experience. It's the rest of your cards for Unrelenting, At a Crossroads, Sharp Vision, Pathfinder. Men's incredibly low experience cost is a part of why she's so good. With Rex, it's that there's nothing you need, but with Men, it's that because you're off-color a survivor, everything you need is dirt cheap. I really have nothing else to add on Men. I don't think there's a compelling argument to move her up much higher. Essentially, she is the weaker version of Tempo Daryl, and Tempo Daryl is a deck that ranks like somewhere towards the middle of S tier, and being down a book is just a substantial downgrade. Her ability is substantially worse at supporting, her signature weakness is substantially more disruptive. I think Men being almost, actually a little more than a full tier down from where I would rank a Tempo Daryl makes a ton of sense, and I really can't see the arguments for moving her higher, and I think she's confidently better than the people at the very bottom of A tier. And there's not a lot to say, she's just fast and cheap and powerful, so let's wrap it up. I've been Rather Incoherent, thank you for your time. If you made it this far, then please do press all the buttons to make the algorithm happy. And a massive thank you to everyone supporting this channel, both as patrons over on Patreon and here on YouTube as channel members. I'll see all of you in the next one.